Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're investigating a pretty fascinating mystery about our own digital brains, specifically how we actually decide what information to trust online. Because think about it, every single day, this massive invisible sorting process is happening right in the palm of your hand. You open an app, you scroll, and boom, you're making these split-second decisions about what's true and what's not. But how are you actually making those calls? Are you really looking at the facts? Or are you relying on invisible cues you don't even realize are there? We're going to decode a recent, eye-opening study out of Penn State University that reveals exactly how our modern news consumption habits are literally rewiring our trust. Get this, startlingly, 1 in 3 people now believe they no longer need to actively seek out the news from traditional outlets like newspapers or television. I mean, think about that for a second. A full third of the population has basically opted out of the hunt for information altogether. They aren't going to a news homepage, they aren't turning on the evening broadcast, and they're definitely not picking up a physical paper. Instead, they've adopted this entirely passive approach to staying informed about the world around them. So, to unpack all of this, our explainer today is going to follow a pretty straightforward roadmap. We'll start with the NFM phenomenon, then look at the Penn State experiment, dive into the psychology of trust, discuss the flattening of authority, and finally, wrap up with fixing our news feeds. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the NFM phenomenon, or waiting for the world to come to you. Be totally honest with yourself here. How many of us just sit back and wait for the headlines to appear in our feeds? You probably didn't wake up today and say to yourself, you know what? I'm going to go search for the most important geopolitical news. Nope. You probably just opened a social app, assuming the really big stuff would naturally just bubble up to the top of your screen. Well, it turns out researchers have actually coined a specific term for this. It's called the news will find me, or NFM mindset, and it's the foundational clue in our investigation today. The NFM mindset is, well, exactly what it sounds like. It's this core belief that if something is truly important, it'll eventually find its way to you, whether that's through an algorithm or a friend's post. You don't need to do the legwork, the network's going to do it for you. It's basically the ultimate digital outsourcing. Now, this mindset creates a really fascinating behavioral split. As the researchers noted, people generally fall into different camps here. On one side, we have mid to low NFM individuals. Since they actively go out looking for news, they keep a pretty critical eye. They evaluate news sources critically and place a much higher value on professional editors and reporters. But then, look at the flip side. High NFM individuals actually consider news recommended by algorithms or social networks to be just as credible as professional sources. No joke, they treat them as absolute equals. Which brings us right to Section 2, the Penn State experiment, testing trust in the digital age. This is where we look at a really fascinating study, led by researchers at Penn State, including scholars like Professor S. Shyam Sunder and Menki Liao, who set out to uncover exactly why this happens. They wanted to pin down the underlying psychological mechanism that causes this sort of blind trust. So the researchers designed this brilliant, highly controlled experiment. First step, they gave 244 participants a questionnaire to figure out their NFM level. Next, they dropped them into these simulated news feeds. Some people saw feeds curated by an editor, some by friends, and others by an algorithm. But here is the absolute genius part of step 3. The actual news stories they read stayed entirely identical across all the groups. Literally, the only thing that changed was the label telling the user who or what recommended the story to them. This let them isolate the exact variable of how just seeing a source label affects our trust. Moving right along to Section 3, the psychology of trust, uncovering our mental clues. So, what did this experiment actually reveal about the inner workings of our digital brains when we're faced with these different labels? Well, the results highlight that our brains are incredibly efficient, maybe even to a fault. They found out that we rely heavily on specific mental shortcuts, which psychologists call heuristics. The first one is the authority heuristic. Now, this is the traditional one we're all pretty used to. When a participant saw that an article was recommended by an editor, it triggered this mental shortcut that essentially says, okay, a professional verified this, therefore it's safe to trust. It relies completely on institutional credibility. But here is where things get incredibly modern. The researchers identified something called the machine heuristic. When that exact same article was labeled as being recommended by an algorithm, it automatically triggered trust for those high NFM users. The subconscious logic going on here is super fascinating. It's basically saying machines are objective, machines process lots of data, so if the machine is showing it to me, it simply must be accurate. They are quite literally blindly trusting the math. And that perfectly sets up the third shortcut, the homophily heuristic. This one explains why we so easily trust news that's shared by our social media friends. Homophily essentially just means love of the same. We naturally perceive our friends as being just like us, right? Sharing our values, our worldview. So if they share an article, our brain takes a quick shortcut and just assumes it has to be trustworthy, completely regardless of where that article actually came from in the first place. Let's head into section 4, the flattening of authority, the invisible threat in our feeds. We really need to look at how these mental shortcuts create a very real vulnerability when you combine them with that news will find me mindset. Because the moment we stop actively looking for news and rely entirely on these shortcuts, the entire landscape of truth fundamentally changes. Co-author Homero Gil de Zuniga noted what he calls a dangerous flattening of authority. And guys, this is a seriously powerful concept. What it means is that on a digital feed, a Pulitzer-winning investigation, a random post from a distant acquaintance, and an AI-generated algorithmic recommendation all look exactly the same. They occupy the exact same real estate on your screen, and for those high NFM individuals, they are given the exact same weight. Authority isn't hierarchical anymore, it is completely flat. This crucial point is perfectly captured in a quote from Professor S. Shamsundar. He states, "Machine as a source is now becoming predominant, undermining the more traditional professional sources, and that's worrisome." It really hits the nail on the head. When the machine itself becomes the ultimate trusted source, the human element, the actual editors and journalists who verify the facts, they just get sidelined. The consequences of this high NFM behavior are actually pretty severe. If you're out there blindly trusting the machine heuristic or the homophilia heuristic, you become incredibly vulnerable to misinformation. Why? Well, because bad actors who want to spread false information don't even have to do the hard work of imitating a trusted news organization anymore. They don't have to trick the editors, they just have to trick the algorithm. If they can gain the network into dropping a story into your feed, your brain's own mental shortcuts are going to do the rest of the work for them. Ultimately, it leads to a society that's way less informed overall and highly susceptible to bias manipulation. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Fixing Our News Feeds, the Defense Strategy. Fortunately, we are not totally helpless in the face of all this. The researchers actually mapped out a clear way to defend our digital habits and push back against this flattening of authority. So here's how we build that defense strategy. Step 1, we need to target high NFM individuals with customized media literacy interventions. Step 2, platforms absolutely must clearly inform readers where the information originally came from. And step 3, highlight the specific steps journalists took to uncover that information. See, it's not just about scolding people to read better, it's about intelligent platform design. By pulling back the curtain on the journalistic process itself and showing the actual rigorous legwork reporters do to verify facts, we can remind users of the real value of human editorial judgment. This effectively short-circuits that blind trust we've been placing in algorithms. As we wrap up this explainer today, I want you to do something for me. Take a look at your phone, think about those mental shortcuts you probably took this morning while you were scrolling, and ask yourself this final question. Who or what curated your news today? Was it an editor with a real commitment to the truth, or was it just a line of code designed to keep you scrolling? The answer to that might just change the way you see the world tomorrow.